I'm going to prove to you that the Bible is an urban legend. Now, how am I going to prove that? I'm going to prove it by the little details that the Bible seems to leave out to make sure that no one can validate whether or not the story is true or false. But yet we have plenty of evidence to demonstrate exactly how false it is, which makes it an urban legend. One of those instances that we're going to talk about is right here. He talks about the Jewish people having living in Egypt as slaves, and that they never noticed nor said anything about the pyramids or the Sphinx ever being there. This is not mentioned in the Old Testament at all. It is completely skipped out, devoid of any words or even any inklings of an idea of the pyramid. So let's look at the story according to what we know. Now, although Egyptologists will say that the Great Pyramids in Giza were built as a tomb for Khufu, to which we know that they are not tombs. But let's just go ahead and let them have that date, even though I believe it is much older. I'm quite positive it is much older. But let's give them that date. And that would put the Great Pyramids of Giza being built in and around 2500 BCE. The story of the Jews coming to coming to Egypt, first with Joseph, had to have occurred around 2000 BCE. So even if we accept Egyptologists' ideas of the pyramids being built during the time frame of Khufu, we see that the pyramids would have already been there. The Sphinx would have already been there by the time Joseph showed up. Now, according to this story, Joseph became the most powerful person in Egypt next to the Pharaoh. This Pharaoh is never mentioned. He is not given a name. Some other very important information that was left out. Because if he was second in command to Pharaoh, you would think that it would have been known and mentioned as to the name of who this Pharaoh is. Isn't it interesting that when Abraham goes to Egypt because of a famine, the Pharaoh is not given a name, but then when another famine happens, they name Amalek? Why are the Egyptian pharaohs never named? In the same way that the pyramids and the Sphinx are never named. Now, going back to the idea of them being in there, they was enslaved there for over 400 years. If you go by some calculations, then you're saying that Moses happened around 1500 BCE. But we know that the Moses story actually happened around 1300 BCE, more into that late 1300s, early 1200s BCE time frame. And remember, the numbers goes backwards. And this is why the Joshua story happens closer to the end of 1200 BCE. Through all this time of them escaping from Egypt and them being in Egypt, not one time was the pyramids mentioned. Not one time was the Sphinx mentioned. Not one time was the name of the Pharaoh mentioned. The only thing that was mentioned was the fact that they supposedly built the city of Pi Ramses, which we know the city of Pi Ramses wasn't built until the 1200s. So there is no way that the time frame can be in the 13 or 15 in the 1500s for Moses and his Exodus. The only reason it is put in such places is because of what is written about when Solomon took over as king, and that it was 400 plus years after the Exodus. This is why they get that number in around the 1500s. But here's the interesting aspect of it. I'm giving you dates, and I have to give you varying dates. The reason why I have to give you varying dates is because the Bible never gives a solid indication of any time frame. The only reason that there is any allusion to time frame is because we have books like Chronicles and books like in Genesis where it talks about at this age, this person begat that person. And at that age, this person begat that person. And at this age, this person begat that person. And you can start with the time frame of Jesus, and you can go through Chronicles with all the begatting. And this is why we get to the biblical time frame that we have, which Genesis, Adam and Eve happens right around 4600 BCE. And then when you move forward in time, you get to around 1200 BCE for the Moses story. But Egypt controlled the entire Levant during that time frame. Certainly, if they was under Egyptian control, they would have known about the pyramids. The pyramids were a great symbol of power for Egypt, yet it was never mentioned. Now, some may come and say that, well, the Assyrians never mentioned the pyramids, the Sumerians never mentioned the pyramids, the Akkadians never mentioned the pyramids. Well, the Sumerians and the Akkadians, no, they didn't mention the pyramids of Egypt because they were a symbol of power for Egypt. They talked about their own pyramids within their own culture. They talked about their ziggurats, often called the zoo. They talked about that. The Assyrians mentioned their dynasty. Most of the records we find about Assyria, they're talking about their people, their laws, their administration, their what's going on with them. They stay within the focus of their kingdom. But these were kingdoms. The Jewish people were just a people group. The Sumerians were never slaves in Egypt. The Akkadians were never slaves in Egypt. The Assyrians were never slaves. As a matter of fact, they conquered northern Egypt. They were never part of that. But like cultures in the similar areas only talked about other cultures that they were connected to. The Assyrians talked about the other cultures around them. The Sumerians and Akkadians talked about other cultures around them. The other cultures that built pyramids, the Sudanese, the Nubians, they built pyramids and they talked about the pyramids of Egypt because they were talking about people that were around them and people that they conquered and were conquered by. Yet, the people who supposedly were there for 400 plus years and enslaved by them never mentioned anything about Egypt having pyramids or a Sphinx, and neither do they give dates. Oh, Pi Ramses. Did they ever think that in history, at some point in time, we'd be able to know when Pi Ramses was built and therefore invalidate their entire story? That it doesn't make any sense that at the time frame we would not ever have found the Meneptah stele, which tells us that a people group called Israelites were conquered by Pharaoh Meneptah in 1204. And this was just a people group while he calls the other people he conquered a nation, a city state. The Israelites were just a people group. And this was happening amazingly at the same time that Joshua was supposedly divvying up the Levant, telling the different Israelite clans to go and genocide the Canaanites and enslave others. Yet they were under Egyptian control at this time frame. They didn't realize that we would have the Amarna letters that shows that these places at the time frame of the Exodus were vassal states to Egypt, and that they were complaining about disputes that they were having with other vassal states and what they were having with dirty people, what they were having with mercenary people that they called the Habaru, which has nothing to do with Hebrew, unless you call the Hebrews dirty mercenary thieves. This is what we have as proof, but we have no proof from them. If they wanted their story to be true, if they didn't want it to be an urban legend, they would have said that, yes, we built the pyramids as slaves. We built them pyramids. But they never claimed that. The idea that the Hebrew slaves built the pyramids of Egypt comes from the movies that you've been watching since the 1900s. That's where this idea comes from. It doesn't come from your Bible at all. So for all my childhood life, when I was believing these stories of showing Israelite slaves building the pyramids, it came from the movies. It was never something that was found in your Bible, and it certainly is not something that is found in history. But yet you believe it because you're unwilling to do the research and unwilling to study. They could have easily, if they wanted their story to be true, have put dates on Moses, dates on Joshua, dates on Abraham. But they failed to do that because if they left it ambiguous enough, with just enough naming of cities and a few people, then you would accept it and believe it. And that is exactly what you have done if you still believe in this religion of the Abrahamics. You accept it and believe it based on 2,000-year-old urban legend stories to try to make a people group into a nation. So what do you guys think? And always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.